welcome to Work Cookie, our weekly gathering of IOs, HRs, recruiters, and a few actors as we try to make the world of work just a little bit better. And once again, with us today is Tim Sharples. Tim, we're going to be talking all September about policing and changing the way policing is done. And it is so relevant to pretty much every other profession out there, but it does give us this microscopic or almost like a petri dish of experimentation where we can look at certain things and how they might be changing, what are the things that are being done in police work, and then just draw lots of parallels to the rest of the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to make sure that we realize that IO psychology is made up of all the workplaces, but as in the advertisement, our workplace, I should say I'm retired law enforcement, the law enforcement workplace is everywhere. So, and we mentioned for last week with Dr. Rick Jacobs that PSYOP is partnering with the Department of Justice and is asking all IOs, not just the IOs that were law enforcement. That's a very, very small subset, very, very small. But oddly enough, through doing this podcast, even from last week, I've met other IOs that have been in law enforcement or are currently in law enforcement. And it makes the job of transforming law enforcement from what it is to what it can be much easier because we already speak the language, and chief executives will get what we do because we get what they do because we worked in the same environment. So,
do you think we're going to end up, because right now, even after just 1 week, I'm like, every police detachment has got to hire an IO psychologist. Like, you've got to have one on staff, not only for your employees, but for the people they deal with. So how far away are we from that? And is it a growth industry?
It is a growth opportunity. Part of it is they're getting the buy-in from leadership. And that's why when I was going down the list, last week we talked about leadership, and this week we're talking about culture. They're important to all organizations, but you look at the Venn diagram, those circles overlap a lot. They share so much, and without effective leadership, you're not going to have a healthy culture.
And can we let's focus on that culture element, because we all know there's a culture with every organization, and the culture around policing. We've made popular television series and movies out of that culture. Sometimes it's a positive view, sometimes not so much. So right across America, where are we with that police culture, and how does it need to change?
So it is changing, but it is almost like one step forward, two steps back. And an example I used when I was getting certified on another emotional intelligence survey, and I was in West Virginia, and Monday, and Tommy called me on this one. I usually like to give the actual data, but it's one of the bigger polls, or one of the valid ones, like Gallup or one of those that are well known that don't have an agenda. And they said for the first time in several years that people are enthusiastic about what law enforcement is doing. They're starting to trust us again. And so we're right at that 51%, 52%. And the next day, we had the Sonia Massey incident where a woman was shot wrongfully. And again, that one's still being tried. The deputy that shot her is still in jail, but it was literally the next day. So right. On Monday, you get the good news, like, yay, we're doing good. And then literally the next day that's released and we're back down. And of course, now it's made news this past weekend about the NFL player in Miami. And as a former motor cop, I've been in those officers' situation before. And kudos to Miami PD for putting out the video sooner. They even said so. But that's showing part of the evolution to your part. But, for our culture as law enforcement used to be, no, it's under investigation, so we can't release the video for 2 weeks, yada, yada, yada. And public scrutiny is saying, no, we need it faster. And as a result, law enforcement is making those strides forward to publish the information faster.
This is not going to be probably an easy question to answer, but we've already sort of mentioned the media, and that's part of, communication. And, I'm not involved with law enforcement. All I get is the media's take on the events as they've happened. So what role does the media play? Am I getting the whole story? I don't think I am. And how can we maybe incorporate that media into improving the culture?
To your point, the communication is key. And the amount of communication that our leaders generally take is very small. That's where it's good to have an effective PIO or a spokesperson, like Tom, much like yourself, to effectively communicate to people. And it's a 24/7 business, so you're not always going to get the PIO, or sometimes they don't have it's a smaller agency, so they don't have a backup PIO. Or they may not even have a public information officer. So it plays a big part of it. And the culture is, again, from one of my agencies I worked for, was every shift lieutenant, because it's a 24/7 industry, was trained in public information officer services. So we had at least some training. So it wasn't, I want to say a goat rope, where it's like, here's a situation, handle it. We did have some training for that.
Well, can you explain to me what the culture actually is in law enforcement? I mean, not being in law enforcement, I was lucky enough to grow up with a good friend who his father was a staff sergeant. But we talk about the culture, we hear about police culture. As I said earlier, we get movies and TV shows about it. But what's really going on? What's that really like?
I'm not sure if you want the serious Tim answer or the funny Tim answer, because
maybe we'll start with one and then go to the other.
yeah. Because that culture goes, so many different ways, but much like every organization out there, because we all, as IOs who represent many organizations, and I'll actually get to a question for everyone present today, is they're all different, but they have some things in common. So if you go back and if you're able to download the reference material, there is one that actually talked about the different types of police culture and transformative, trying to get us from where we were to where we can be. And but that's a nonstop equation. It's not something, a goal to be attained. It's something, it's a mission to keep on going with, because society is always changing, but also leadership is always changing. That's again how the Venn diagram circles back onto culture, because as your leadership changes, so does the culture. And there's something like 3,000 agencies out there, some crazy number. I don't know that off the top of my head right now, but each one's going to have their own culture based upon leadership.
Well, speaking of leadership, just looking at the big open world in front of us when it comes to organizations and their leadership, there's got to be a change there as well, because we see leaders who, what I was doing in the 1980s worked for me then and it's working for me now.
No, it's not. I will tell you, no, it's not.
So and I imagine we're seeing the same thing in policing and leadership. So can we change the mindset, or do we have to change the people?
We can change the mindset. And that, great question. Thank you for that. When I started going down the IO doctoral path all these years ago, it was through testing. And the idea was going to be through testing, we can, a very simplistic view, that we can screen out all the bad guys and keep in the good ones. And I realized that would take forever, literally. And so that's why I went down the whole emotional intelligence path, because it's a teachable skill and it's one that can be assessed. So therefore, as you're onboarding new people, you see through emotional intelligence, are they a cultural fit for law enforcement or for your agency? But also, because it's teachable, your existing police population, those officers that are doing the job every single day, it's a teachable skill, do their assessments and their surveys, and then have the classwork. And also for leadership, the accountability part, because the fish stinks from the head down. So if your leaders do not embody emotional intelligence, your newest officers aren't going to embody that either. It's got to be all or nothing.
Is it, especially when it comes to something like emotional intelligence, is it one size fits all, or do police forces in rural communities need some different training than a police force that's working in the inner city?
Yes, to both points. So it's one size does not fit all, because that's why they're going for Daniel Goleman's model, which is the one that I use. Goleman said there are 4 clusters and 12 competencies that support those clusters. So there are 12 of those. So while you can be, much like you have musical intelligence or other different types of intelligences, emotional intelligence is not a one size fits all. So hopefully that answers the first part of the question. The second part is the officers in the law enforcement agency needs to reflect the community they serve. So the needs of the community are going to demand what the services and how the officers respond. So you're still going to have the procedural justice type. You treat people with respect and dignity and voice. So those are still going to be in play and still enforce the laws of your state. But the communication style may be a little bit different, or your interactions may be different. So yeah, hopefully I answered both parts of that question.
So we've kind of talked around, leaderships and organizational change, especially with the culture. How do we actually do that? Because I imagine there are some police forces that, they pick up the phone and they call you and they're willing to make those changes. They're willing to step forward. But there are other groups who might not be convinced yet. So how do you get that messaging out to them and get them on that path?
That's going to come from the community, and that's what has so much of the positive change that's been driven over the years, and I'm counting even before 2020, right. Has happened from the community's outcry and demand for better policing services. I want to go back to Dr. Rick Jacobs, who's driving the IO Psychology Initiative. And for those that weren't here last week, SOP has signed a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Justice, and that an IO psychologist will help with these initiatives. And as Rick Jacobs pointed out, they're spending an approximately $150 million per year. He said, worst case scenario, that's 150 test sites. All they have to do is change the language, and you will have 150 IOs at least helping to measure these initiatives that we're spending money on. So that's how we get that's one way to get it. Because again, there are very few IOs that are law enforcement like I am, kind of a unicorn. But do we say the word psychologist? Most law enforcement officers kind of get, the little bit of pushback. So once you explain what IO psychology does and is, they get a little more buy-in, but then again, where's the money? There's all those other logistical questions that come on board with that.
Having that dual almost personality of being an IO psychologist and a police officer, especially for those IO psychologists who may be listening to the Work Cookie podcast, who are still in university and thinking of perhaps this is a career path for me. What advice would you give them before taking that step?
It's actually a pathway that I had heard from someone else. I can't recall where. Go with your early adopters. Tom, as you pointed out, not every leader is the same or has the same agenda. So you go with your early adopters that want to change and find those out. And you basically get out like doing like this podcast. I have connected with so many other people that want to get on board with this initiative to transform policing to the next best iteration of itself. That it's been amazing. So, put yourself out there, especially students. That's the time to do it. That you still have your safety net. Have your dissertation or whatever, or your master's thesis, reflect your passion on that.
And jump in, anyone else, if you've got some questions or if you'd like to just chime in. I want to just sort of slip past leadership a little bit right now and talk about the workplace that law enforcement is involved with, and all the stress, because I can't imagine a more stressful career than law enforcement. So how are you going to incorporate that? Is it part of the cultural shift, or is there some other way that we're going to deal with stress and well-being in law enforcement?
Luckily, in today's day and age, actually even going back to 67, there was always a mental health component to the law enforcement workplace. So with the stigma being able to be reduced, again, it depends on your agency and the feedback from your agency. And I can give you an example of that here in a second. They are incorporating, and this is the positive sign. Again, I always look for the hope in the messaging, that they are having law enforcement mental wellness coaches in place, and that is their full-time job. They are offering resources or mandating resources within the workplace. So they're really removing a lot of the old, like Marshall Goldsmith said his quote from the book, what got us here won't get us there. So it got us here about stigmatizing officers, telling them to, just tough it out or whatever. Obviously isn't working. So in order to get there, which is the next steps, is they're changing their ways. They're learning. Again, not all agencies are going to be the same. And I told you to give you an example, and I love this one. If you have a healthcare initiative, I think, Tom, you and I spoke about this earlier, and for, again, physical healthcare, and you want people to maybe lose weight or get more physically fit, BMI, whatever, and your chief executive refers to that initiative as fat camp. True story. How do you think your people are going to respond to the wellness aspects of that? They're not, because it's been stigmatized. And of course, your chief executive, your opinion matters more than the others. Like that idea or not, as a chief executive, your opinion matters the most. So when you first a healthcare initiative for the physical health of your employees, people in your care, and you refer to it as fat camp, that just shot down the whole effort.
Yeah.
And that's just one example.
Yeah, I'm sure there's many, many more. Thank you very much, Tim. Nick, let's go to you.
Yeah, it's a very specialized sort of field when you think about law enforcement and all of the moving parts that are pushing in it, on it, and through it, the impact that it has, because there are clear and measurable consequences to mistakes that happen. We were talking about a little bit how the community should shape how law enforcement interacts with them. And so that means they need to have kind of a spirit of adaptability. And as well, but we talk about leadership, and yes, there's the hierarchy of ranks and things like that. But is there an element of the culture that is frustrated or fueled by some of the bureaucracy? Because it is taxpayer money, it is some of that where they are accountable to the community as well as internally. And how does that play out? And how do you find the bigger portion of culture for any department that's trying to go through some of these changes?
Thank you for that, Nick. And yeah, it's a unique culture. That's why I was aware as we're doing this 4-part series over the month of September that we keep relating back to General IO as well, because although we're talking about law enforcement, we still share a lot of the overlap. But one of the unique parts to your question is that, yes, we are working for governmental agencies, so therefore you're dealing with the things like longevity. You're not easily, if you don't like the culture or the leadership, it's more difficult to leave because you're leaving behind all the benefits if you go to another agency. Or if you have rank, you can't take that with you unless maybe there's a new agency forming. So if I'm a retired lieutenant, if I wanted to go to another agency, I may have to be a sergeant or even officer if I dislike my agency that much. So it's unlike the private sector. So there's those disparities. But you're also dealing with the public, which is a lot more vocal versus shareholders. They have, shareholders may have an annual meeting, or there's several levels of anonymity that leadership can have between them and their shareholders versus the public. You're right there at the next city hall council meeting, or your local news, or an investigation from local news channel or something like that. So, yeah, so some similarities and differences that make change sometimes more difficult to happen, because there's also funding. People want change, but they want to pay for it. I'll use an example. Body cameras. Big push for body cameras, especially after 2020. The cost of body cameras that's part of the process. They see a body camera, say $500. What do you do with the cloud storage? Now, some of you guys in the tech industry, guys and gals, may know how expensive it is to store all that video. So there are other costs associated with it. So while there's the demand for body-worn cameras, once you get the real numbers and dollars, there's not always that funding available.
Thank you very much for that, Nick. Dr. Matt, let's go to you.
Yeah, I absolutely am enjoying the conversation. You know, when it comes to policing today, it feels like there's so much focus on what needs to change, but not as much about how we actually get there and what has been done and what, you know, when you look at what has been done and you can say, okay, this was successful. Now, how did we do that, and how can we build upon that? There's so much opportunity there to take that approach and say, okay, let's build in small incremental steps to really get that sustainable change. You know, we've all seen those headlines, and we're even talking about it today about trust issues, burnout, resistance to new ideas. You just mentioned body cameras. What I really find interesting is is how some departments have started using those practical, almost behind the scenes IO psychology techniques to address those challenges in ways that actually work. So things like improving communication, addressing the officer's stress, and even getting people on board with changes without that, this is the way we've always done it mentality, changing that mentality. And Dr. Tim, you talked about, you know, that message from leadership is so crucial. And it is. And if you're unable to break through to that leader to stress and emphasize the importance of that clear, supportive communication, and maybe that's, you know, times in a similar regard with organizations, you know, take it out of policing and put it into general organization. When you have that leader who you can identify, this is where the pain point is coming. This is where a lot of our efforts are getting derailed. I'm not a fan of the phrase, but I'm going to go ahead and use it. Coach up or coach out. You either have to get on board with this, or maybe we need to move you another area, because the impact that you are having is very detrimental, not just to your team, not just to this community, but to the overall organization, and the mentality that surrounds law enforcement or policing. A couple quick things. I know we've got a lot of hands. You know, when we talk about that, managing burnout and stress, the emotional intelligence, you know, policing is a high stress environment. It can lead to a lot of burnout, disengagement, turnover. One of the Seattle, I think it was Seattle Police Department, introduced a number of years back, peer support systems to make that mental health service available to officers, implemented mandatory debriefing sessions after major incidents to normalize the employee well-being conversations. It reduces, what they started to see was that it was reducing that long-term stress. It reduced absenteeism. It actually improved the morale, because again, that normalization around the conversation, around the experience, it was not diminished or cast with any negative aspect. It was saying this is a real part of the job, a real part of life, and we need to address this, and then providing those additional resources. But by taking that first step and saying, here is where we're going to actually make this piece mandatory, everything beyond this piece is optional. But by doing that, it normalizes that conversation and introduces it has the potential to sort of lower some of the anxiety or some of the resistance to that. And then the last piece that I wanted to talk about, when you talked about the body cameras, another example that I thought of was in Rialto, California. They introduced small pilot initiatives that included body cameras to try and get with the intention that their entire force will have this. But in that implementation process, one of the big key pieces that they included, and this is where IO psychology can really come into play, was they introduced a lot of feedback within that department-wide rollout. They wanted to know from the officers, what is your experience when you're wearing this? What is your perception of this? They also clearly communicated why we're doing this and what the intended outcome was. It wasn't just to have a gotcha moment, but to really provide that transparency and build that community trust. What they saw is it reduced, there was a 50% reduction in use of force incidents, 88% drop in complaints. They really, by implementing those pieces and having the individuals involved in that conversation, they were able to make it something that was effective and sustainable and benefited not just the individuals, not just the department, but the community at large. So again, I see a lot of hands. I want to pass it off to somebody else, but I love when the conversation is not just about, we need to change this, we need to change that, but saying, how has this been done? Where has it been effective? What can we learn from that? And how can we continue to build off of that momentum to really have that positive effect and impact for individual people and the communities at large.
Yeah. Thank you, man. I want to point out several things you said. So we asked about how do we hold people accountable, leaders to move forward, hold them accountable, because a lot of are allowed to slide under the radar. But to all your other points, yes, yes, and yes. So everything you said is correct, because we're about being evidence-based, and IOs through the program being piloted by PSYOP and the DOJ. If you want to be part of the change, after 2020, we had a lot of IOs who said, rah, 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 we want to be part of the change. Well, here it is 4 years later, and now we know who the people who are steering this. And so Dr. Rick Jacobs, who was last week, and again, he should be in the notes, his contact email, reach out to him, because as he's moving forward with this, all these programs, again, $150 million per year, an IO, he's working to try to have at least one IO per program to measure their effectiveness. So that way they're no longer just throwing money at it. It's now measurable and sustainable. And that's the word I want to make sure, besides evidence, Matt, sustainable, because it's not just about, a short-term change. We want sustainability and that next evolution to serve the communities better. So thank you for all those points.
I get a feeling Dr. Jacobs' inbox is going to start to get very full.
Good. Yeah.
There we go. Lee, so glad you put your hand up, because I got a question for you. With your military background, I'm sure you're seeing a lot of parallels, but I get the sense that maybe the military is a little ahead of the game as opposed to the police forces. So are there perhaps a few things that you could share with Tim that the police forces could actually learn from?
It's hard to say, because, yes, I did some military law enforcement, stuff, but that's different, it's different training, different mandate, you got posse comitatus laws, meaning you can't be out in the community doing things. So, there's definitely some difference there. But yes, there are some things that I'm sure could be implemented, as far as some of the stress management techniques and the de-escalation. Because there's a lot of military that is trained heavily in de-escalation, because you're off in another culture somewhere where things could go sideways really, really fast, and a lot of people could end up dead. So you really have to be on point on that. And in fact, some of our special operations are some of the most highly trained in de-escalation, which, sounds counterintuitive, but it's really not. Their job, we talk about, the job is to, break things and kill people. Well, sort of. But the reality is, what a lot of them do is work embedded in these other cultures to help them help themselves. A lot of your Green Berets and stuff, they are, they've been sent in as advisors, not necessarily on, war per se, but on, how to deal with the conflicts, and how to de-escalate a lot of those situations that don't have to end up in combat. But one thing that I will think, psychological safety is huge, right? And the military and law enforcement are both very high stress environments. There's the threat of death. When you lace up your boots, you don't know if you're coming home. And that's stressful. And one of the big things that we've got to normalize in both realms is proactive mental health. Because so often it's reactive, because something happens, and then we have an after action and we send them to the counselor. We've all seen the parodies of that in movies and stuff. The guys, oh God, I gotta go see the shrink, whatever, because somebody got shot or whatever. And you've got to normalize that on the front end. We got to do check-ins. We, call it, do it coaching. IOs can definitely help with a coaching kind of thing. So we can go in and we can talk about this ahead of time, to where we can deal with stressors. And one thing that the military does that I'm not sure, most other industries, I'm not sure about law enforcement, is whole person. The military owns you 24/7. It's just a fact. You get paid by the day. There is no overtime. We weekends don't exist. We call it liberty because you don't have to get them, and it's a 24/7 organization. So, but being able to understand, that Officer Smith is having some difficulties at home. Well, that could be very, very crucial information, because maybe the patience that this person may normally have is a little bit less. And so that could be a use of force issue potentially, because we know what stress reduces your patience. It makes you quicker to anger, makes violence a little closer to the surface. There's all these things that we know that contributes to. But if we know that, maybe we can encourage use of I'm assuming they have employee assistance, just like, a lot of civilian organizations do, that, maybe we can encourage you to get something. Maybe maybe part of the benefits package is we can provide family services so that we can help you, because the best way to deal with a violent situation is to prevent it. And the old adage, ounce of prevention better than a pound of cure. I mean, it's so true. And that stuff is very, very important. Because I work, now, what I do on the side is I'm a firearms instructor, and we work with civilians and we work with police. And we don't just talk about how to put it on, put holes in targets. We talk about when not, what the legalities are, what you can do, what you can't do, de-escalation, avoidance. We talk about all those things because we want to make sure that, well, one, everybody goes home, and preferably they go home without any extra holes. And so we do a lot of work with that. Just from what I've observed to other ranges, we go way beyond the norm in that, in ours, and I think that it should be the norm, but my original point, that before Tom sent me off on this tangent, was that, this is such a complex situation, so much more than your normal org change process, whatever, because it's so visible. There is the threat of bodily harm, and the public has a vested interest in a way that they don't normally have with an organization. And so, and Dr. Tim brought up a great point with the money, because we need to have enough officers to protect the community and the officers, because we need to be able to make sure that they're not working, 12 hours a day, 6 days out of the week, or 14 hours or whatever, because we know there are places that happens. But at the same time, we got to balance that, because if the community sees a police officer in every corner, that can start to feel a little threatening. Now I'm thinking I'm in a police state. When are the jackboots coming? Though you have to balance that. And so you really have to work on the communication there. And that's where the community policing is so important. The police need to be seen in the community as part of the community, as opposed to the people who are the keepers, basically. I've actually heard someone talk to their children. They saw a police officer, and they're like, "You better behave, or that cop over there is going to come get you." Wrong thing. That child should not be scared of a police officer. That child should know, if something goes wrong, that they can go to that police officer, and that police officer will help them. That's what we should be teaching. And to do that, we've got to not keep them separate. They have to be part of the community. And that is so important, but it's so not the norm in a lot of places. And that's, people don't, let's face it, most people don't think about a police officer until something goes wrong, or the blue lights show up in their rearview mirror. And then the thoughts are not positive. And we need to do something about that, because, the peace officers, as we talked about last week, are there to help. And the communication is so key there. And, and having someone on staff to do communication is crucial. I tell you what, where I live here, the guy who was doing the PAO for the local thing is hysterical. His Twitter feed, I almost joined Twitter just to follow him. He was that funny. But he was constantly, he's actually the city's PAO now. He actually moved up to the full city, but constantly giving us updates. Here's what's going on. Here's where there's an issue. Here's, avoid this area right now. We got, traffic's blocked off. And there was a partnership. And, we have a very good, well-respected police force here, as opposed to some of the other places that maybe that's not the case. But anyway, I'm going to get off my soapbox because, like Dr. Matt said, lots of hands, and I could go for a while on this.
Well, Lee, thank you for that. I'm going to go in reverse order because I was actually, anyway. So you mentioned, I'll go in reverse order, Keepers versus Guardians. And thank you for mentioning Lisa Broderick's initiative, Police to Peace, because words have power. So that's part of, so we said Keepers versus Guardians, that warrior versus guardian mindset that was part of President Obama's 21st century policing initiative. That for again, the example when I was working on that committee, that they're using the term synonymously. So once we did a deeper dive and said the smallest of words have power, and that we adopted a guardian mindset versus a warrior mindset, because we're not occupiers, we are protecting our community. So that was the last, going in reverse. Preventing it, about the violence and emotional intelligence and officers not acting like they would normally would. Many agencies, so it's not a definitive, I'll just say many, have an early warning system where officers, when it's noted, are having behavioral changes, instead of going through a more formalized process where, they go for a psychological evaluation, which can be a career killer. They have an early warning system for, it's another safety net for their people to, their leadership to talk with that officer having those issues. So that's that issue. And then last but not least, you mentioned about coaching. Mentorship is a big push right now that's not been mentioned. So a lot of people, like for instance, when I was doing the dissertation, they were saying, oh, these officers need de-escalation training. And every time they said it, I'd hear emotional intelligence. They're saying they're saying emotional intelligence, but they're saying it through de-escalation, which they're not the same. They're not the same words, but they're asking for the same goals. So when you mention coaching, I want to say mentorship, because those, as we all know, those are two different things. But that's where it's important to have an IO in there to explain to people that may use those terms interchangeably, when there's a time for coaching and when there's a time for mentorship. Then Matt, I forgot, I left off, I wrote this down. A way to all those, you rattle off a lot of great things about sustainability. We need to celebrate the wins. Where are you, Matt? Dang it. There you are. Celebrate those wins. We always hear about the bad departments. I just pulled up one the other day on YouTube, one of the local ones from where I retired, to see how the chief was forced to resign. Well, we see that, and that makes news. We need to celebrate the wins. What departments are doing the right things, and make them like teaching hospitals, which have the lowest death rates and highest survivability rates, because you have many people that are looking at a problem and how to fix it. And they're willing to take those chances and risks to solve for the greater good. So celebrate those wins. And I think that was for Matt. And last but not least, I think it was Nick. We're talking about leadership. The average tenure of a chief executive is about 3 years. That's average. So gone are the days where my former chief was there for 23 years. And that was after he retired from the state police in the Northeast. So, yeah. So now you're looking at the average tenure is 3 years. So not a lot of time to change or to implement change, or it could be there, for whatever reasons, but the average tenure is 3 years.
Thank you very much for
All
that.
right, I updated.
Amy, always good to see you. Let's go to you.
Hey, hi all. So I had a couple comments to make, and then I had a question to end with that I'd like to hear some feedback on. So policing in general, I mean, that's a very unique role. Not that there aren't other unique roles, right? But when you think about things like high-speed chases, risk of interacting with people in your job with weapons, gangs, like really extreme circumstances in which officers are engaged in. I mean, those are some very unique experiences, and they create unique backgrounds, unique personalities, right? They can create situations with PTSD, a different kind of humor, even, I guess, in my experience with the officers I know, right? Maybe a little more morbid humor in that. And so one of the things that I found interesting was how that creates a different circumstance for the way to engage with officers and create change with them. An example I'll give really briefly. My husband was in a class where they were using one of those feedback tools like Mentimeter or whatever that website is. Well, the responses from the officers, as the anonymous responses, were a little more crass and a little more direct than you might expect from your kind of standard meeting, right? And that really just kind of describes, I think, the personality differences sometimes that can be there, or the job and the role itself and how different it can be than maybe going into my technology development meetings and using a feedback tool to ask about how your last week went, right? It's a very different response you'll receive from that group. And so I think it's just interesting and different when you think about the engagement techniques you have to use to create change, to create sustainable change, and just to consider meeting officers where they are and where their roles bring them, because it is almost entirely different from a lot of other jobs, right, that you have out there. And as a follow-up question to that, I wonder, what impact are you seeing police unions have, or what role are police unions having in helping implement change, sustain change, or bring into the mix? You've got a couple of generations, or at least 2 or 3 generations of officers, right? That also brings some interesting bridging that needs to happen. What role are police unions playing in that?
I mean, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So I'll start with the first. So you're completely correct. The role of law enforcement is unique. There is no other group or organization that does what law enforcement does. Because you're the military, but that's different. That's the military. No one does what the civilian police force does. So the private sector, there's no duplication of it. So you're absolutely correct. So using the word unique for all of that is absolutely true. Feedback, yeah, that's good. Again, that's why we have to have peer support, things like that, where you have people that are in law enforcement that understand the work role. And that's one of the issues. And that's why I'm a huge advocate for peer support specialists, because you have police officers supporting other police officers. So I didn't catch the name. What was that feedback tool that you said that they gave some crass answers?
A Mentimeter. So it's like a virtual tool where you can scan the QR code and respond in real time during a training. And some of the responses I heard about were extremely funny. That's the word I'll use. Funny.
Yeah, I used a word cloud one time live, and I will never do that again. So yeah, and that's part of the culture. And then again, I also say all public safety, because a matter of fact, I was sure in the dedication of my dissertation to include jailers, fire services, communications officers, because they're often overlooked, but they're still part of emergency services. So you talk about that twisted sense of humor. I was getting our car service yesterday, and the guy is a retired paramedic. And so he's like, yeah, my wife and I have that twisted sense of humor because they're both, retired paramedics. So it kind of goes with the territory. And it's, it's obviously it's a psychological safety mechanism. And then last but not least, unions. Your results may vary. Some unions can be helpful. And again, it boils down to what we talked about week 1, leadership. Some leaders can see the bigger picture and say we need to hold our people accountable. And by our people, it means everyone that's a member, but also the leadership, because they are also the bargaining unit in some cases. In the South, it's a right to work state. So the FOP or the PBA, the Fraternal Order of Police or Police Benevolent Association, may or may not be your bargaining unit that can be your voice. But usually we pay dues for those for legal protections. So that way, if we do get into some sort of snafu, we're not hopefully going to lose our house or any of that sort of thing. It's just so that's, it depends on where you are, and the leadership of your local union. So unions can be a change for a force for good, or a force for, I'll just say, the status quo. And I've seen both sides of that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
And Dr. Martha, always good to see you. And you've always got some great comments. Let's go to you.
Thank you, Tom. Tom, you actually got us started, nudged us in the right direction, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to stress. My focus as an IO psychologist is a comprehensive approach to stress management. And when you talk about law enforcement, when you talk about the kinds of jobs when sometimes people want to shoot you simply because of the job that you're doing, the potential for stress and burnout are incredible. My experience with law enforcement, specifically police departments, unfortunately, is that all too often any kind of response is more reactive than proactive. When you get yourself on the news as an agency, when there's questionable behavior, when there are accusations that are brought forth, when it's all over the news, all over the headlines, that's when it becomes important enough to not be so worried about the time and the money and the budget and the answering to whoever you need to answer to get things in place. And although things are changing, I think we all learn as humans from other people's mistakes, especially when they're disastrous. We don't learn quickly enough. So although I'm seeing a shift to not only be reactive when it comes to a comprehensive approach to stress management, which of course is not limited to the workspace and your work hours. You have to approach the entire individual and their entire existence, their work domain and their non-work domain. But again, I'm seeing a little more of a change, of a shift, but a lot of it is still reactive.
Jim, you want to comment on that?
Dr. Martha? Yes. To sum it up, yes. Proactive is always better than reactive, and that's where it's up to us as IOs to sell them on the bigger picture. But again, not that I was going to spend the money, because what we're doing can be both proactive and reactive. But I could bore you all with to the cows come home with stories of 32 years of trying to be proactive, or other people trying to get ahead of issues, and the leadership in place at that time. Or back to Emmy's point about the unions, status quo is good. It's not an emergency until it is, and some don't want to deal with it. So it boils down to, again, week one about leadership. And but if you have a culture, or if you have a citizenry culture that says we care about our city, and that means the water department, the trash department, and the police department, and they get involved in those areas, that culture can cause a shift within the policing agency and the leadership to be held accountable. So it's a multifaceted way to look at the example. But you're right. Proactive is the harder hill to climb versus reactive, and stress management, again, it's getting better, but not all agencies are going to handle it the same way. And again, having as a peer support specialist, I train the local city, all their peer support folks. Very proud of that fact. And I still work with my agencies from where I retired, and it is different between the agency up here and the agency down there, our agencies down there, about handling stress management. Some just want to check the box and say, look what we've done, and they put it on a TikTok video, when in reality, from an IO perspective, it's not being used by the officers it's meant to serve. So it's one of those things of trust but verify. So we're saying the right things, but it's a matter of, are we doing the right things?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for that. And just before we go to you, Rich, I've got to ask you this question, and maybe this will only come from an actor, but remember the show Cops?
Yep.
And then like that was the first one, and now there's like a whole network, and we get this view of what police work is like. in our society, is that helping, or is or is that we are police, we are warriors, and that's all it is. I mean, he makes great reality TV, and I'm sure, if you work a 10-hour shift, 9.5 hours are not worth putting on TV. So is it a realistic view, and is it really not helping the situation?
I don't think it's really helping the situation. I would use it as an instructor of videos what not to do. Yeah. And you asked earlier about the cop shows for me, and I half jokingly, Reno 911, for me, that is a pretty realistic explanation of a lot of what I saw. I mean, some of it, some of it was like cops. But the day-to-day stuff of what happens out on the streets, you just can't make this stuff up. Here, hold my beer. It's kind of a combination of both. And again, it depends on your department. If you're working, a major city like Atlanta, New York City, Chicago, those are going to be very different experiences, much like we talked about culture, who was talking about big agency, small agency, and how we speak with people. Same thing, if big city, small city.
Well, Police Academy is still one of my favorite movies. So there you go. Rich, let's go to you, because I'm sure that's realistic.
Weird thing, my dad was actually on Cops in the first season, breaking down a door. But anyway, so I was coming prepared to this discussion, thinking about Shine's model of culture, assumptions, values, and those espoused values, and then the artifacts, and then thinking about on the artifact side of things, like the outward behaviors, signs, symbols, and all of that. How I know that the Chicago Police Department, I was actually just at a hiring event earlier this week, where I saw them having a booth, trying to get people, and there's this branding campaign that the city of Chicago has had for at least the last couple of years, highlighting some of the changes in the work culture, in the on the force there. I guess what my question related to this is how hard is the change management part of that outward part, right? To get the full adoption across the force, to have the officers and the support folks, and because it's not just officers, right? I mean, there's other support folks on the police department. How hard is the change management to have people, fully adopt that across the board? Thinking about, you have your early adopters, and then you have your late adopters and your laggards. How do you see that, particularly on those smaller forces, who they may be steeped in a deeper culture that, they may have a harder time changing. Is that a fair question to ask?
Well, that's a very good question. That's one of the issues that would come up with in trying to do any sort of change. And I have a mentor out there who said he would never take a client until it was the 11th hour and 50th minute. And I just looked at him and just laughed. I said, yeah, but some chiefs just can't tell time. And so those agencies that are maybe possibly under a consent decree, where the federal government has come in and said, y'all can't run your own agency, so we're going to run it for you. They have a motivation to move forward and to fix what needs to be fixed. So they are 11th hour, 50th minute. They know they want to fix, and they're very active participants because now they're being held accountable. But the smaller agencies that can fly under the radar, or when things go bad, they can retire, unless there is maybe a city administrator, mayor, whatever, wanting to saying, we need this change and we need it now by this date, and put some smart goals on them, specific, measurable, all this sort of good stuff. They don't have the impetus to do it. They just may pay lip service to it. So it's about accountability.
So the motivation seems to be then, is it purely like bureaucracy, or if we don't do this, it feels kind of negative across the board instead of, yeah, instead of like positively motivate, like if we do this, here are the positive outcomes instead of some kind of, fallout if we don't do it.
Honestly, so yeah, you're right. It is negative, and and again, I always have to put the word hope up in big letters to remind me of that. And so here's a positive story that we'll talk about leadership. And I was very, very fortunate that my very, very first client was a large agency, and they were all so not quite as big as Chicago, but they're large enough to have their own police academy. And they were unique in the fact of they grew up in that city. They rose up from officer all the way to now command staff, including the chief. And their issue was when we were talking, and they said, we are not leaving our policing agency better than we found it. And that's me for the first time, because they had been, now that you got the chief who came up from officer, all the command staff, they were all homegrown folks. And it's happening on their watch. That was their motivation. And so they are very active in wanting to do changing and testing and assessments and training, all the things that IOs do, and a very good experience for everyone involved. But so whoever mentioned about maybe it was you, Rich, about the early adopters and the later and all that falling on the spectrum, they were very, very early adopters because they were motivated, and they're intrinsically motivated because it's their reputation, their families, versus again the consent decree or things of that nature, where it's extrinsically they're saying, hey, you need to fix this or else you're gonna be prosecuted. So, but those, again, I would you never talk about clients, celebrate that win. And so I just celebrate their story because it is a huge win. That what happens when the right things are done for the right reasons, everyone was a winner.
Thank you very much for that, Rich. We got time for one more. Dr. Matt, let's go to you.
Well, to build off of what Rich was saying, Rich, I love what you brought in about the espoused values and the artifacts using Shine's model. What that reminded me of, I actually read an article earlier this summer, and Dr. Tim, I'm curious if you had any thoughts on this. It was talking about the impact of the type of vehicle that police departments had used. And a lot of them, a number of years back, switched away from the Crown Victoria or the Crown Vic. They went to the Dodge Charger or the what was the Ford model. But anyway, it had more power, it had more capability, and all these great features. But what they started to see was that it actually also had more of an aggressive style. It created a negative perception with the community. There was more of a militarized image. Lee, like what you were talking about, that perception from the community of, if you don't behave, they're going to get you. And that the something as simple as the choice of vehicle had unintentional consequences that reinforced this conflict or this aggressive relationship. And there's been a lot of interesting research around shifting to more of those neutral or less aggressive vehicle designs, something that can still have the power and the capability that's needed, the space that's needed, all those features, but maybe doesn't have that perception that unintentionally came along with some of these muscle cars or some of these powerful vehicles. And so, I mean, I know that there's a lot of research that's for departments that have started to switch or transition out of that vehicle design, whether it's for practical or economic or, sustainable environmental reasons, whatever they may be. One of the other factors they're considering is, what is the perception of this vehicle? And so I love, Rich, when you were talking about those artifacts, is that physical representations. And so, when the research talks about the choice of vehicle, it's not just about performance or cost, but also that perception, that can hinder or help those community engagements. So, Dr. Tim, I don't know, do you have any thoughts around that, or what have you seen in that realm when our organization switching away from that? And if so, is that benefiting them?
It's not familiar with the article, but it absolutely makes sense. So so much like the Crown Vic, the reason why I went with Crown Vic is because it's no longer made. Same for the Dodge Charger, it also is no longer being made. The agencies I worked with, I've gone to the Ford Explorer because they're also more community oriented, but also a practical matter and that sort of stuff. So they went that route. But it absolutely makes sense when your car is designed to even look aggressive. it just makes sense. But yeah, they're sort of going away from it for practical reasons as they no longer make it.
Minivans. Put them all in minivans. See if that changes people's perceptions.
No. Take that back. You take that back.
All right.
Say that,
Now.
Bob, but I got pulled over by a minivan once.
Really?
Yeah,
Only you, Lee.
that's a whole other story there.
And Tim, do you have time for one more question? Because I see Imani's hand up.
Sure. Good.
Imani, let's go to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I've heard Tim talking about, you talked about emotional intelligence, and just wanted to chime in on that. I hear you talking about celebrating small wins, and that's like a good thing. It can fall under maybe building empathy within our police force. But then what also I hear you talking about is accountability, which is something that I hold on ego and entitlement somehow. That's like something that we all as human beings have. And under emotional intelligence, some of the things that we have that really make us not have that self-control is when we really get into so much in our egos and also feeling entitlement. And then also being in this powerful role also plays into that as well. So when you talk about emotional intelligence, I would like to speak on the self-management point of view, whereby also kind of like helps us have that self-regulations as well, because this is what we really want to really go down to. I wanted to really ask about, because in terms of boundaries, we're going to have to draw boundaries and then also assert boundaries. So I wanted to really ask about how do you guys go about that within the police forces in terms of, drawing those boundaries and setting boundaries? Because to me, I believe when we are self-regulating ourselves, we have to have those boundaries, we have to assert those boundaries. And how we create this, somehow in my mind, I was thinking, is having being accountable and being authentic, also drawing those boundaries with these police officers, creating that fear back to them, and then also having those direct consequences that they know that can happen when they kind of do these violations within the communities. Because we are having so much of, we need these body cameras because we lost the trust within the communities now. So how do we build back the trust within the community? Of course, is when they see this accountability is going on. But then one of the things that I'm seeing is that we're talking about accountability, but it's not being effective within the bodies of the police stations and stuff. So how, if the boundaries have been broken, how are you guys emphasizing and asserting these boundaries to create this whole self-regulation of these people? Are there any direct consequences that you guys are having, or are you just stuck on the immunity? Because also the authenticity is about also admitting that things are changing, and how do we look forward to put new things that are working for today in this century that we are in? So what kind of boundaries are you guys drawing within all these organizations to really promote self-regulations with these police officers? Because in as much as we're talking about mental health, in as much as we're talking about, maybe also even I do emotionally supporting these people, there's going to be a draw line at some point, because it's in communities, everybody has that consequence of when something goes wrong, we incur financial, and I've seen that's like a system that US uses. When you put like a financial impact on somebody as a consequence, we look out for so many things. Just like how when we run a traffic light, it's a financial consequence. Sometimes I would like to think also divorce, somehow we get into this whole financial consequences as well. Everything has a financial consequence. Is it so I would like to know, what is it that you're using to really draw these boundaries and also like emphasize and assert on these boundaries within organization to promote your emotional intelligence within these organizations?
So, Imani, thank you so much for that question. There's a lot to unpack there in a very short period of time. One of the main things I wanted to cover was public perception and trust, and part of that is to answer your question is through the culture. So, let's celebrate the win up in West Virginia. That's why I was up there. They have what's called Project EQ, which every single certified peace officer in the state of West Virginia, that includes their corrections officers, receive their own EQ survey, emotional quotient or EI, emotional intelligence survey, with their answers and their areas of strengths and weaknesses. And then they also receive training on top of that. What the message sends is their entire culture for every peace officer in the state of West Virginia is that, again, what got you there will not get, what got us here will not get you there. Is there now is an expectation of a culture change of how law enforcement treats the public that they serve. So that's one of the wins. As far as the others, that's a statewide initiative. That's a great win. I'm trying to bring that to my home state. I'll leave that, out in the open for now, what state that is. Hopefully do a big reveal when we, launch that initiative. Other states, it's just hit or miss. It depends on, are you active? Can I ask you a quick question? Are you active, a voice for change on your local police department? Do you attend any of the city council meetings? Have you been to a citizens academy to get to know your police agency any better? Do they even offer one?
So the accountability in what I'm asking for is kind of still missing, because now let me give you a direct example. The public is holding you guys accountable by shame. It's using the shaming tactic, getting these videos and posting them. And that's how you guys have been, somehow we have seen a change in how certain things have been going. So now the thing I wanted to know is, how are you guys also, what tactic are you using to really tame this self-management or self-control within your police officers? Because you can train them. I can get the knowledge. If there's no direct consequence on anything, especially as human beings, because we all know our egos gets in the way. We feel entitled, especially when we're in those powerful places. So what is it? Are you creating? Because I feel like the direct consequence will be creating fear, and it's going to be a little bit brutal for me to say, is creating fear, because one of the most emotionally intelligent people we are seeing, who have empathy, who have self-regulations, if you see, especially in collective communities, there's a bit of fear created there. So fear can be in two ways. There's that fear that causes anxiety, stress, and stuff, but there's that fear that keeps you in line, in check, so that you can be able to self-control yourself. So in terms of those tactics to really put self-control or management, what are you directly using to create that? Because the community is using shaming somehow, and then also getting the accountability with the body cameras, but we're not seeing how police lines. And if you become so transparent with that, if the community sees that, that's when maybe you start gaining back the trust through hope that they will be seeing you guys having these things being enacted.
So I can't speak for all agencies. I am a retiree. I can speak to what I did and what my agency did, and it's a representative of what many agencies are doing, which is, per policy, as a shift lieutenant, I had to review random body cameras, since you mentioned that as an example, per month, per officer that was on my shift, to assess as far as how are they interacting with the public, because not all interactions are going to lead to a complaint. And there are some that, you should have led to a complaint, and I would have that discussion with my officer, my perspective on it. But I was just one of four. My peer from another shift may not do that, or it's just luck of the draw. So we are using body camera, or I should say some agencies, I should say I'm retired, are using body worn cameras to do spot assessments on their officers. That's just one way, but yes, there's definitely a lot more accountability happening, but it's still not where I think it should be, because again, the whole culture is not changed. And again, until the society and the public we serve and law enforcement and the leadership, which is last week's course, get on the same page and work together towards a common goal together, not as enemies or as perceived enemies with shame. And again, having an IO psychologist guide them along the way, because some of this stuff just doesn't happen spontaneously. I go back to, we are all IOs, is that we have an initiative where we can help to foster change. Let's be part of that change, and we can make it expedited versus just letting it coast and wait for the next tragedy to happen.
Okay.
And with
Also-
and to thank. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, Imani. We're
Yeah,
now
I
about
guess
10 minutes over time.
just say also, can we just get a little bit of more act of kindness from you guys? Because that will create the empathy and bring back, that kind of connection with you and your community. I'm just saying. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Money, I'm on board with you. And matter of fact, give me a call afterwards. We'll talk, because there's a reason why I spent 8 years, one class per quarter, getting an IO psychology degree, because I want to change the profession. And I've dedicated the remainder of my life. I'm retired. I'm
Well, thank you
dedicating the
so
remainder
much.
of my life to improving this profession so that way we can better serve the public.
Right. Thank you so much. I'll call.
And I love the fact we're connecting IOs all the time. Thank you very much, Tim. We just scratched the surface. I think we might have to have the sequel month somewhere down the line. Anything that you wanted to cover today that you can briefly just maybe? I mean, we didn't talk at all about teamwork and collaboration.
There was so much, with culture, there's so much, and thank you all for contributing. I know we're well past our hour's time. Culture is a huge thing, and you that all contributed to it, you understand how big and nebulous is. The impetus is, we as IOs, when we go and talk about culture, and if they recall, if a leadership wants us to talk about culture, we have to inform them, well, culture talks about stress and all these other things. It may not be as simple as as leadership thinks. So let's endeavor to get on board with those early adopters, celebrate those wins, and work our way down.
And of course, we are going to be back next week continuing this conversation. But next week, we're going to focus on voices of experience, insights from veteran officers on enhancing modern policing. So with that, thank you again very much, Tim. Do we have any special guests joining us next week?
Yes, we do. We have David Schiff from the Operating Group. He has been a peace officer since 1970 or 71. And then Dr. Greg Campbell from Talent Smart EQ. He is the one who is responsible for Project EQ in West Virginia. And both of them have seen a lot of changes in their careers.
Great. Sounds wonderful. So join us again in 1 week's time, and we'll continue this conversation. So thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for everyone who contributed today. And we'll see everyone back here in 1 week's time. Bye now.
Thank you all.
Thank you.